Let's continue looking at these different aspects of love that you're describing in your book here. The Unconditional Love is appreciating aspects of life, and there's one here that I'd really like to hear what you have to say about, and it's forgiveness, because for me it seems that forgiveness is a really big one, and it's the kind of thing that is, in a way, it's kind of difficult to tackle, because in some ways it may seem easy just to say, oh well, I forgive, I forgive, and that's the end of it. But actually, some of these really big issues can go very, very deep. And how do you forgive when, like, your whole life has been affected by something or other? I mean, obviously parents is a big thing, but there could be all sorts of issues that keep coming up, and if you're really aware, you can see that actually you're still running on issues that never got properly resolved, forgiven, if you like. So let me just first of all read what you've written in your book, and I'll read out these 3 short paragraphs and see if we can take some points from what you've said. Forgiveness is the exquisite healer in each of us. To forgive is more than divine. It is a practical and permanent release from our limiting beliefs and perspectives. By letting go of our emotional attachments through forgiveness, allows us to love more vibrantly. This is the first step to true inner freedom. Nothing in life is beyond an act of forgiveness. No matter the perceived pain or grievance, self-inflicted or accepted from another, we have the power to forgive. This fantastic gift is ever ready to share the bounty of love through its release into our lives. Before another moment passes, forgive all experiences and people, including yourself. Unconditional love is forgiveness. To love ourselves is to forgive ourselves. To forgive ourselves is to find the pearl within. So, forgiving ourselves is that's perhaps something that isn't something that we tend to think about all that readily. We tend to think about forgiving other people. But come on, set me straight on this. Tell me all about it.
Well, certainly forgiveness, it is the exquisite healer in us. It is an incredibly important aspect of the whole realization of unconditional love, because it is, in a way, the way we get there. To be more unlimited, to be more unconditional, we have to release those things that we have placed in our reality or attached ourselves to in our reality that keep us limited. They can be beliefs, direct experiences, perspectives, things that we revolve over and over and over again: hurts, pains, sorrows, shames, guilts, worries, concerns. All these things are literally parts of our experience as we grow through life, and the ones that we don't detach from or let go of continue to be part of our psyche, literally, our thoughts and our feelings. Which is why the whole notion of forgiveness of self is extraordinary when thought of, because we are, in a sense, trained like we're supposed to kind of, we're told, forgiveness is a great thing, and forgive this, forgive that, and it's usually external. But like so many things we've been discussing, when rightly understood, this stuff is less about what's going on outside of us and more about the thoughts and feelings and our emotional reactions internally, and how we then set up further experiences, because we're constantly thinking or feeling or attaching ourselves to old hurts and old pains, which kind of causes us to look at this constant part of our life about the present moment, the now moment. This is the moment we are here to live. This is our physical moment right here, right now. This is our moment where we are physically, emotionally, mentally, and as we say generally, spiritually, however we wish to interpret that personally, all right here. So to understand the present moment, the now moment that we are in, our point of power, this is the moment where we can make different choices, different decisions. That helps us to put the whole idea of forgiveness into better perspective, because now we realize that these thoughts and feelings, these emotional hurts, pains, sufferings, whatever they are within us, and they are coming from our past, which, as we've discussed before, the past is the past. It's a thought and memory of something that happened. It may be a very strong memory, it may be a very strong feeling about something that we experienced in our past. Yet it still resides in the past. It actually has no power to influence us right here, right now, unless we invite it in. The same can be said in this present moment, that our imagination, the things that we consider for the future, are simply thoughts and feelings of potentials in the future. And at the moment, they are not actually coming to pass, lest we put our energy into it. Well, isn't it interesting if we have, under typical circumstances, and certainly this is something I wrestled with and came to greater and greater awareness with early on, was that if I had emotional hurts or pains or sufferings from the past and I was holding on to them desperately, and these same emotional hurts, pains, angers, whatever I was engaging were part of my present psyche, then of course I was in this moment making a choice to relive the past, which of course automatically creates a future, because I'm projecting these out. I'm using the constant of my imagination, but I'm actually using it to imagine what experience I had in the past as part of something to look forward to in the future. So the point of power really is in our ability to forgive and then very potently forget. In my awareness and understanding, true forgiveness is forgetfulness. In other words, we so forgive it, and this kind of hints to what you were saying, like, forgiveness isn't useful as a throw-off phrase. It doesn't actually provide any true forgiveness if we don't eventually forget. In other words, to forgive so deeply ourselves and everything and everyone and circumstances all around it, that we would literally no longer have any energy associated to it, other than say, what had been a tragic moment or a difficult moment in our past. Through true forgiveness, if we remember it all, we remember it with compassionate heart. We remember it from the standpoint of what a beautiful gift it was that helped us get us here. And that kind of leads into this bigger observation again. Events, experiences, perspectives that we engage and encounter in life, when they are seemingly tragic or dramatic or traumatic or extraordinarily difficult, or certainly leave, many will say, a scar or mark, and we're talking about the full range, because in this context we have to kind of understand that we are all equipped differently. So in say my case, for example, I had a fairly decent childhood and everything, and certainly there were things there that eventually I came to understand were important to forgive, but they weren't necessarily as, challenging or horrific as many other stories as I've heard from other people. And yet something like an embarrassing moment in school could have had as much an impact on me because of the collective of my psyche that somebody else would have shrugged off, because it would have never bothered them. It would have never affected them in any way. And yet, because of who I was, and my level of self-esteem, self-worth in that circumstance, an embarrassing event could hold a tremendous amount of emotional pain that I would be experiencing over and over again many times in my life. So, to understand forgiveness, a incredibly horrific event, as we're often taught, murder, death, mayhem, rape, all these things which are considered, absolutes, and not everybody's experiencing these, but these are how people will assume that those things seem to be the worst of the worst, and so they're usually the most unforgivable. And yet, in the bigger picture, some people can handle those events really well and they never get affected by them. Other people can have essentially a much narrower range of challenging events, and yet those can affect their psyche much, much deeper. So I kind of try to encourage people to get past this idea of what's, truly difficult, truly horrendous, truly awful, and kind of look at all the subtleties, because in fact, when we go through this whole kind of forgiveness opportunity, it's often in the subtleties where we have the greatest, profoundest, change. When I started kind of understanding forgiveness for myself and realized that I kind of, it was appropriate in time for me to address forgiving, people, places, and things, I kind of looked at what I call the boulders, the big ones, the big pieces, and kind of first off, because certainly in my case, beginning point, I wasn't aware of self-forgiveness. That wasn't really part of my vocabulary, my consciousness. So I'm like, okay, I'm standard, look outside ourselves. What do I need to forgive? It doesn't necessarily have to happen that way, but that's the way it did for me. And for me, the first place was forgiving my parents, individually and collectively. And I kind of saw that as one big boulder. And I kind of blanketly began the process of forgiving them. And the way I did that is I had come to this understanding that, who I was when many of these things happen. As a child, we look at things with kind of a limited sense of experience, a limited understanding about things. We rely on our parents to be the best educators, providers, mentors, models. And let's face it, who of us is? They're kind of coming from their generation, which came from the previous generation. And, certainly everybody is doing the best they know how in the moment. And, in a moment, if a person has anger, that's the only place they can express from. If you're the child on the receiving end of that anger, we don't understand the difference. We don't understand that it was an issue in our parents. We take it on personally. So we build our own set of circumstantial perspectives as children. And of course, as parents, as adults, we build and build and build. And sure enough, as adults, we have more and more experiences, often which, many corroborate each other because we have, in fact, not let go of our original pains and sufferings. And so it becomes its own version of a snowball. But then, because we do have more experience, we begin to say, well, had I known then what I know now, that cliche phrase that we use, we would have done it differently. Well, we didn't because we couldn't, because we didn't. We couldn't do it differently because, in fact, at that time, we didn't know differently. We didn't know how to understand our anger, or we didn't know how to understand our shame. We didn't understand, so as adults, we have more experiences, so we think we have more perspectives. As children, we have fewer perspectives, and we kind of think things should be more natural and more loving. And we call that kind of the generation gap. That's that interplay between childlike, awareness and adult, supposedly experienced awareness. And so when we kind of look at these various types of perspectives that are going on, coupled with circumstantially the environment we grow up in, the types of people that surround us, the quality of the people and the reflections they give back, whether they're encouraging or aspiring, or whether they, are demeaning and, negative and cause us to feel less worthy of ourselves. All of these things factor in. And for me, by looking at my parents, I could say with this kind of new understanding, this broader understanding, say, oh, my parents really did do the best they knew how. And I kind of, in the series of a few days, weeks, moments, months, I kind of thought about all the various things, but rather than going back in and thinking about all the painful experiences, which I was really living and reliving all the painful. I mean, I only had, at times hatred and condemnation for experiences that I'd had. I was, inwardly challenged by lots of things that I thought should have been different. With this kind of more compassionate set of eyes, I kind of went back into my memories and I started seeing each player, each parent, for example, in this beginning stage, as having done the best they know how. And with compassion, it was much easier for me to start to realize, like, wow, their hurt, their pain, their suffering made them come from that space. How much of it did I take on? What can I do to release? What can I do to forgive? And so I started that process of literally forgiving. It was really quite fascinating because as quickly as that started to come up, I started feeling so much forgiveness. I was living up north at the time, and I would actually start sending them little cassette tapes of songs that were really, loving and gushy, and cards and little notes. And I was like, because I was feeling so much joy and gratitude for them. Well, if we actually step back, and of course I was not as aware of it at the time, but if we actually step back now and say, well, what else was going on? It's like, it was, in a way, I was setting the stage for lots of healing, because then my parents felt, that they could forgive themselves for all the things that they thought they didn't do quite right, because they realized I was, forgiving them. So, it was this wonderful interplay and interconnected interplay. And lots more healing exponentially happened as a result of my choices to forgive. And at the same time, though, I can now see so utterly clearly is all of this was really going on inside me. I was actually forgiving all of my limited experiences, my limited perspectives, my own self-esteem, things that I had taken on, that I probably had no tools to say, oh, this is mine, this isn't mine. And there was this extraordinary inner healing going on as I was actually forgiving in these initial stages, the most, for me, the ones that were most difficult to forgive, insofar as parental type issues. And the more I did this, the more I started looking friends, relationships, people that I considered bullies in school that bullied me. It was like this all of a sudden I had this understanding that I could forgive all of them. I could forgive all of it. And forgiveness is a process. I wouldn't say this is all stuff that happened overnight. I can say that by addressing these big boulders, I was able to make extraordinary progress in releasing myself from these old hurts, these old shames. Do they still come up, decades later? Absolutely. Yet the forgiveness is more immediate and more recognized and more understood. So to tackle those big ones has made it easier for these subtleties, to come up. And particularly for me, once I kind of did a fair amount of this inner clearing, not only did I then have a better understanding of, how I operate, how people around me operate, where they're coming from, kind of where I came from, but then on bigger issues like people I don't know. In other words, when we start to look at, the rights and wrongs that we perceive of the world, I have a much greater sense of compassion and forgiveness with these larger archetypal energies, like when the community doesn't necessarily do what I think could do for the highest and best good, of everybody. When I see things happening in the world that could certainly be done differently, rather than recapitulate and go back into these old shames and hurts and thinking, all this stuff is going on and how dare they, and all these old energies, I look at the global community with much greater compassionate eyes, because I understand the same dynamics that I experienced on a very microcosmic level between, myself, obviously, first and foremost, and then those close around me. These are happening in big ways on the planet. Mm-hmm. So there was this inner healing that now allows me to have a bigger inner healing, because now I can actually be more forgiving towards the world, which allows me to be in a very different position when I'm talking to people that are close to me, or if I'm talking to people that I've never met. And I find for the very first conversations, I have a much greater understanding of forgiveness. And so I come with that forgiveness as part of my makeup. And that certainly has been because I've taken the time to do the forgiveness internally. And then, in times, it certainly works to also do forgiveness externally. I mean, it is a circular flow. So if there are things we can't forgive about ourselves, then we can certainly at least do what we will more commonly know is begin to forgive those around us, because there is a constant interplay. And that inner and outer, forgiveness is something that just goes everywhere. And that's how we say that little grain of sand that had irritated us for so long, when we get into that state of forgiveness, it does become that pearl. It becomes this exquisite, beautiful, wow, thank you, it got me here. Mm-hmm. And that's a very different position. How many of us say, wow, thank you for my life, it got me here. I'm so glad I went through those things. No matter how horrific they were, they made me a better person. That's what forgiveness provides.
Mm-hmm. That's a very, very positive way of looking at it, isn't it? So, really the first stage in forgiveness is being willing to consider forgiving both other people and oneself. But also to recognize that it can take a lot of work in some instances, and perhaps tackling the bigger issues is the right way to start, or is it tackling smaller issues, or doesn't it really make
I don't think it really particularly matters. In my case, it worked very well to look at what I considered my bigger boulders. For some people, the pain and the hurt that they perceive that they carry can be so strong that maybe, in fact, it's in the little things that they build a momentum. So maybe in the little things that they can more easily forgive. Maybe, being out amongst strangers and say being in a grocery line or something, and what would have typically bothered us, we can say, oh, let me practice forgiveness. Or we're out driving in our cars and things that would have happened with other drivers that would have naturally bothered us, we can say, let me forgive them, rather than having this reaction. What that will do is it will work again either way. Forgiveness is an exquisite healer. Simply beginning somewhere will work. And I definitely understand, the bigger ones are often the most core issue and the most difficult. But again, taken in framework, and it reminds me of, my part of what actually got me to understand forgiveness was working through it in a very early part of my life as I was doing this work with my parents inwardly. I had this experience of working with my mother at the end of one of my workshops that she attended, where she actually announced that she'd been raped. One of the big taboos, one of the big, somebody murdered this person, somebody raped this person, somebody, stole all this person's money, these really big, devastating, life-devastating experiences. And we're talking in these cases, interplays, it could also be like a, house could burn down and people have difficulty forgiving that scenario, but who do you blame? Because, forgiveness is usually resolving the blame. We blame something outside ourselves rather than taking responsibility. In the case of my mother bringing this up at the end of a workshop, something that I never had heard in my life, I had compassion. I also had this bigger understanding, like, wow, this event that happened in her teenage years had ruled her life throughout my entire life. In other words, I wasn't even born when this happened, and yet what had happened and her perspective at the time, her vulnerability at the time, set this whole stage where her entire life had morphed forward over several decades, to the point where when we were doing this workshop, she actually had cancer for 5-6 years at that point that was not going into remission. And very interestingly, it all started to fall in place. I realized this whole understanding that all this anger, guilt, shame, hatred towards all men, all these things had not only affected her life and been totally suppressed within and ate away at her literally like a cancer, they had also affected myself, my sister, my father, and obviously countless other people, because everything from that particular moment seemed to color everything else she experienced, even though none of us knew about it. It was totally secret within her. It still came out everywhere else. And of course, from what I had understood previous to that time, she had a fairly difficult childhood. So it wasn't just that particular instance. And this is where I say, people have such a strong reaction and identification to certain words, rape, murder, whatever what are considered humanly terrible. They are just events. And in fact, in this particular instance, it's a great example, because this is an event that happened in a very short duration, just a matter of minutes probably, in a particular day. Over the course of my mother's entire lifetime, up to that point, the matter of a few minutes had affected her emotionally, mentally, and of course in many ways physically, and of course also spiritually, all the way forward to the point where her body was actually giving way because she wasn't resolving this. She was carrying this hatred, anger, and shame. And certainly in our society, shame is a crucial difficulty, because these events, when they happen, even in this modern time, people don't talk about it. You don't work, there's nothing to work it out. There's no discussion of it, there's no understanding of it. So we're in many ways no better positioned in a way to handle some of these things, because nobody talks about it. It's all relegated to something, pushed away, shoved away, because they are the social taboos. And yet I'm standing there watching this and realizing how affected I had been by my mother's mental and emotional, and I'm sure even physical ways of dealing with life. And, as I looked at her, I said, interestingly enough, and this is before the whole audience, I said, grateful, ever so grateful that she finally had the courage to bring it out before a group. I also said, in the big scheme of things, no one cares. And of course, utter gasp in the entire audience. How dare you say no one cares? And I said, well, wait a minute, let me explain this. No one knew prior to this moment that this had ever happened. No one there knew about it. I said, it's all been within her. And once this event of the day was over, everybody was going to go home and they were going to get on with their lives. And they may have had a moment's memory that my mother had said it, but they had no relationship to the event itself. And they're going to be busy in their lives and they're going to forget. Quite honestly, probably before they get home, they're going to completely have forgotten that this ever happened because it's not part of their life. I said, but look how it has affected her life to the point where she now has cancer related to all these other things going on in her life. I said, and then look at her immediate family who continues to walk with her, live with her, sister, and how, we've been affected by her belief systems that she created as a way to help her understand these difficult shames and guilts and angers that she had carried for so long. She would continue to carry it. Now, at least the big difference was it was no longer a secret. So now it had at least been released and let go of. Kind of fast forward a couple of months later, and again, as I say, she had had cancer for 6 years and had never gone into official remission. We had the opportunity to actually role play her. She was very willing and interested in role playing with the rapist to go through forgiveness, because again, this was this time period where I was sending notices, information cards, and saying, look, I forgive you and I thank you and I'm grateful for you and appreciate you. And I think that actually stimulated an inspiration that she could actually forgive the rapist. So we actually did a role play, and she was able to say everything that she needed to say to this individual. It lasted less than 15 minutes. The momentary rage, the anger, everything that she'd actually carried for some 30, 40 years came out in a very brief time period. But when she was done, she was actually done. I mean, she herself said, I'm done. I choose no longer to carry this hate, this anger, this shame, this guilt. I'm done. This has affected my entire life. It's affected everyone around me. I'm just done. And you could just tell that the kind of the collapse and the release, she was done. She left shortly the next day. She was visiting at the time, and I sent her a card. Said, congratulations, you no longer have cancer. 6 months later, she no longer had cancer. And for me, that was profound because I understood the mechanism of how we heals. It heals physically, it heals emotionally, it heals mentally, and it heals us, in our whole spiritual interconnectedness. It was extraordinary for me to go through, and I'm actually grateful that she went through it because it gave me such enormous opportunity to understand so many things in my life, because she actually endured it. So what was a grain of sand in her world, which was kind of deposited as a grain of sand in my world, because I had to kind of deal with her filters of the world through most of my life, out of it came this incredible pearl for all of us. So forgiveness, forgotten, released, the past is the past, we're in the present moment, which frees us to create a completely different world than constantly recreating the world that we lived in. And so forgiveness, I can't think of a quality that is more profound, more substantial, more pertinent, more an aspect of love, truly, than forgiveness. And yet, again, if we look at that really big picture, rightly understood, at some point, forgiveness isn't even part of our experience, because we're in such gratitude for everything that happens in life, because we understand that it's all good and it's all there to help us better understand ourselves and those around us. I can actually envision a day where forgiveness might actually leave our vocabulary. And not necessarily now. I think it's an extraordinarily potent piece, because most people are not forgiving of their past. But I can say, fast forward, some distant future, that, forgiveness will just have an understanding that it's all been valuable. Which, in fact, if we kind of take this idea that we're forgiving now, if a great number of people started to truly forgive now, we would be creating very different realities. So, in fact, my kind of vision of forgiveness going away is because we wouldn't need it anymore, because we wouldn't be doing the things to one another, because we wouldn't be recreating the shames and the guilts and the angers, and we'd be coming from such an extraordinarily different place, and then have such a extraordinarily different reality. Forgiveness is that potent, that powerful.
Are you saying that gratitude is actually kind of fast track to forgiveness?
gratitude is probably a natural interconnected aspect of forgiveness. Because at first, when we are coming from shame, guilt, anger, hatred, all these really raw negative emotions that are kind of universal. I mean, we will attach them to particular events, but they are really quite universal, and we keep using them. The idea of choosing, like you had said earlier, the very intention to forgive is really what starts the process. And then how deeply we go is to the point of whether we can truly forget. If we can get to such a point, I would say experientially, the feeling of gratitude comes more, it grows as we let go. The truer the forgiveness is, the more gratitude and compassion come out as its replacement energy. In other words, as we accept the fact that whatever happened, we did the best we knew how, they did the best they knew how, and everything is worthy of an act of forgiveness. Absolutely everything is worthy. Because in fact, we do want to free ourselves, and we do want to free those, and we don't want to have to set up stages where, because, my mother's case, the rapist, I mean, on the surface, we have such a quick reaction. Negative begets negative. Hatred begets hatred. We see these things. We know that they're dramatic influences on our human, they're intrusions. And yet, on some level, that young man, born a child like any other, had his own set of unique circumstances. Nobody ever bothers to go to a causal level and say, well, what made him get to that point to do what he did? In other words, what if he had an understanding of forgiveness and forgetfulness? Maybe he had been able to work through things, he would have never contemplated doing that. So, these are important pieces to look at a very causal level and be willing to let go on a very causal level. And what we get out of it is that gratitude and compassion, because we literally transform. We take this very dull negative energy that is very quick to respond, and we take it into our heart and we say, I accept it, I love it, I'm choosing to let it go. And then what is going to be the natural feeling when you've transmuted hatred into love? You're going to feel gratitude, because you'll be grateful that you're no longer bound by the hatred. So yes, I mean, gratitude and compassion. Can you start from there with forgiveness? Oh, I'm sure you can start from anywhere. If that's the easier way to segue into forgiveness, if you can start to feel gratitude towards something, forgiveness then will be that interconnected spiral circle.
Well, I mean, for all the really big issues in your life that need forgiveness, there are probably 1,000 tiny little instances that maybe also need forgiveness. And it would be good to think that maybe there's a fast track to dealing with, kind of bulk forgiveness. I mean, one thing I've always been astonished about is how strong an emotional charge there is to embarrassing events. I mean, you mentioned embarrassing events earlier on.
Really, where I came from too, those were my key issues.
I mean, the number of times that I will wince at something that I've done. I mean, it just happens so often, and it's like in my life, the things that have the strongest memories are the things that are most embarrassing. I mean, maybe this is all a big ego issue. It's the ego that's embarrassed, and you've created this sense of identity that is so easily threatened by stupid things that you've done, or things that just completely by
innocently
chance.
Done,
And yet clearly one carries these things through your life, and they can keep coming up, and it's a blessing to be able to forget them, but then they'll come up again, and you think, oh my God, oh. And kind of bulk forgiveness would be great if you could deal with all these different events in your life, rather than having them continually coming back to you. And if it's possible to do that sort of thing through the kind of gratitude that lets you say that all these things that happened, brought me to where I am today, and where I am today I have cause to be thankful for, and perhaps there is, perhaps there is a way to do that. But I think also what you're saying, what we're really talking about, is how forgiveness is an aspect of love, and as you said, the act of forgiveness is an act of love, didn't you? And presumably unconditional love, really, because you forgive regardless. You just completely forgive and forget.
It is that true self-acceptance, which is its own aspect of forgiveness. And one of the things that happens is that when we start to invoke forgiveness, whether we start with the big boulders, if we're brave enough to go and right in there and chisel those down to smaller and smaller pebbles, because kind of what you're saying is that once you've broken down that big boulder, now you get chunks and chunks, and they, we keep working on them. The one thing that is beautiful about forgiveness is that when we do make the choice in our life to say, okay, perhaps for the very first time in our life, I'm going to start to look at life through the eyes and ears, heart, through the experiences of forgiveness. And I'm going to see how well I can forgive. And in other words, if you can't do it unconditionally right off the bat, and I don't know if I could do it unconditionally right off the bat. I just started somewhere. And by starting somewhere, what happens is these key emotional attachments from our past that are wrapped up in experiences, which are really, when you look at it, the events that we say are, the difficult events, whether it's a rape or a murder or an accident or something that, altered our life so tremendously, or an embarrassing moment, which can just as easily, an unkind word from a teacher could literally cause what could have been, a major scientific or political leader or something, to cause them to not go that way. That's how, these things can be so extraordinary. And it's not so much about the common tragic, the things that we collectively think are awful. An unkind word can be as devastating to a particular person as a rape or a murder or, some other type of violent intrusion. So I constantly try to share with people, because, very few people experience these ultimate tragic, dramatic events. Most of us have, all the other types of events that were just as difficult to us in relationship to our psyche as a very traumatic event can be to someone else. So kind of get out of this game of, what's worse, what's better, because that's all sense of judgment. That doesn't help any of us, because if we look at it that way, then we can say, well, I had a good life and nothing to forgive. Well, in fact, we actually usually do. The mere fact that we start to forgive, and because all of these things do have a tendency to be interconnected, a single event has many, 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 many little choices that lead up to it, many different experiences that lead up to it, which we tend to not notice, which means there's a whole lot of interconnectedness. And we start to pull on the string of a big event or a little event, we're still pulling on a string. We're still taking that first chisel to that first boulder. It has this ripple effect. It has this multidimensional effect. Forgiveness has a tendency to begin to resolve things that we would never have thought of. In fact, we don't have to deal with every instance. We can't. It's impossible. There are too many things going on in any given moment, right here and right now. We could not possibly forgive every single instance. So in a way, there is a bit of a blanket energy that we can say, well, we're forgiving everything, provided we are truly forgiving, provided we're really accepting, okay, I made a mistake, forgive it. I had an experience, it was not the best, I forgive it. I forgive the people, places, things around, the circumstances, all that. What's really wonderful about forgiveness is that it has its own expansion in our life, that if we choose right now to begin to forgive things from our past, that means we're invoking forgiveness right now, which means we are also, it isn't a one-way street. The forgiveness of our past is also saying we're going to approach life with a sense of forgiveness, which means we are forgiving in a sense in advance the potential mistakes and the potential experiences, because when we get there, if we have a time of forgiveness a day from now, or we make a mistake, or we have an embarrassing moment, we've already started forgiveness in our life, so we can begin to forgive more quickly. So it isn't just the past, it affects our future. It's because of the choice right now. And that with all these aspects of love, they're critical to the point of understanding that right now is the time you can do something about it. And even if we can't say, if a person has experienced something extraordinarily traumatic, bullying, an unkind word, a rape, a molestation, these taboo words that, murder or murder of, if we can't forgive the rapist, the murderer, the molester, I understand that. Those are very difficult collective psyche moments, and they can be very, very deep and very difficult. But if we can say that we at least are willing to try, that little tiny fraction of a crack of a willingness is already in itself the seed of forgiveness, because we're now looking at something that was totally abhorrent to our nature and absolutely did not deserve an ounce of our attention other than to stay in the hatred and the anger and the shame and the guilt. Which, who are we hurting? Really get down to it, all this stuff is running in us. Now, we're affecting countless people, absolutely, but it is hurting us the most. This is the piece that I think that really, people don't want to forgive because they don't want to forget, because they don't want to experience it again. But by not forgiving, by not forgetting, they are constantly experiencing it. And this is the irony of people's attachment to the old hurt and the old shame and the old guilt and the old worry, because they are constantly reliving the same energy, and therefore they haven't escaped anything. They haven't eluded, evaded, avoided anything. In fact, they're creating more of it because that they're living from hatred, they're living from shame, they're living from all these lower vibrational qualities that are not love. And they keep, in one way or another, with every person they contact, with every experience they have, they keep creating and recreating it. Forgiveness is that exquisite healer. It's that redeeming aspect where we say, I'm not going to carry this in me anymore. I'm choosing for myself. I have no control over anybody else. I have no control over how anybody else sees me. I have no control over anybody else's actions. I choose to forgive. And when we can be that fundamental, think of what an extraordinary impact we have with all the people, places, and things around us. I mean, at that moment of taking a very selfish act and saying, I'm choosing to let go, we are becoming instantly selfless, because now we're healing not only ourselves, but we're healing all these intertangled relationships that we had been carrying with us, and the way we acted and reacted with everybody. I mean, I have a completely different relationship with my friends, previously called my parents. I actually have friendships with my parents because I can see them for who they are and let them be for who they are, and be thankful for everything they did. I have a completely different dynamic today than I did when I was a child, or even in early adulthood before I started forgiveness. They, in turn, wonderfully so, have picked up on this, and they have gone in their own way and forgiven so much of their parental upbringing, which, of course, when they're then visiting friends and relatives and stories come up about what had happened, they have a completely different dialogue. They have a completely different conversation. They start talking about how much they appreciated their parents and all the things that had been collectively, all the siblings getting together, and all the difficulties that they all want to talk about. And my parents come from a state of forgiveness, and greater forgiveness. And so there's this wonderful healing that expands outside of us because of the choices made within. That's why all of this, the choices we do for ourselves, because we're the ones that walk with our journey the most intimately throughout our lives. No one can ever actually know us. Had my mother gone to her grave, never announcing, none of us would have known. There's simply, and yet, what an incredible gift by her having the courage to share, because now we understood more of who she was, where she came from, and because she was literally willing to forgive it when she did bring it up, we weren't then bound by the story of hatred and anger. I mean, a lot of people, and I'm sure you have this experience too, you walk in conversation with someone and you realize that they're carrying lots of hatred because everything out of their mouth is hatred. it's anger, it's embarrassment or shame or guilt. I mean, you can be around people and you realize that they're actually talking about all of them. They're talking about everything everybody did to them. There is no forgiveness. There's no release. In this particular instance, my mother suppressed it, and it affected her down to a very physical level. There are certainly plenty of people who are going out there and they're talking about it all the time, blaming everything else. We certainly see it as a collective in our societies right now, cultures all around the world. Everybody's choosing to blame everybody else because nobody's taking the responsibility. Why are they not taking the responsibility? Because forgiveness is certainly a cornerstone of that responsibility. Because once we choose to take responsibility for our lives, we really, forgiveness is, the next truly logical thing to invoke, because how else can we be responsible if we don't start understanding who we were is not who we are unless we invite it in. And then that's where you had actually used the word, that forgiveness is very difficult. It is only from the standpoint that we perceive it to be difficult or challenging to start it. And what I love to share is start it anyway, because certainly in my case, 20 years down the road, having started forgiveness in my life, I live an extraordinarily different life. And I'm able to talk about forgiveness in completely different ways than people would normally talk about it, if they talk about it at all, because it is still one of those throw-off words. Just forgive them. But there's, what does that mean? What does it mean really? And I can't say to a person, if they come and say, well, have I forgiven it enough? I'm like, well, apparently not, because you're still talking about it. In other words, forgiveness is unique to each individual. We know when we've forgiven because it no longer affects us. And it's extraordinary in the fact that when we can get to that point, that we have a much more potent, powerful effect around those around us, and it keeps going out. Because in fact, at the moment that we would have normally come from anger, having been attached to some event from the past that we hadn't resolved, let go of, we pass that anger along, which then person can pick up on, and then they travel somewhere, and then they pass the anger along. So what happens when we pass compassion and gratitude along, when we pass a smile along? We may be the person who, because we've forgiven, can change another person's life by showing them that forgiveness is possible, when they never thought it was even possible because it was too big, it was too grandiose, too overwhelming. And we say it's possible. Think about what that impact is over time with humanity at large. It's extraordinary. Forgiveness is that crucial a part of understanding unconditional love, unlike really any other quality or aspect, because it has the closest way to reveal the unconditional love. Because in fact, once we get rid of those layers of hurt and shame and guilt and worry and all the myriad things that hold us down, that we truly come from a more unlimited way of being, from a more unconditional aspect, self-acceptance, acceptance of others, and gratitude, compassion, forgiveness. These are all qualities of love. When allowed to express, naturally express, because they're all right there. Which is why doing one gets the other, doing it brings the other. It's all beautifully interconnected, just as all these negative experiences have been beautifully interconnected and have ruled us in different ways, because that we've layered and held back pieces. And whether it's an embarrassing moment or a truly, horrific, tragic event, doesn't matter. At least consider the possibility that we are forgivable, we're forgiving, other people are forgivable, other people are forgiving. And in fact, the more we do it, the more we'll experience that.
That was really great, Harold.
Thank you.
Yeah, really.
Very practical, and to me, that's the important piece. It is extraordinarily practical, and we will feel and experience the results based on our willingness to do it.
Good. Okay.